The air in the solicitor's office was thick with the scent of old paper and despair. It was a smell Lady Annalise Beaumont had become intimately familiar with in the 3 months since her father's passing. It clung to the damask curtains in their townhouse, a ghostly shroud testifying to the slow, creeping ruin that had consumed their lives. Outside, the London rain fell in a relentless, gray sheet, blurring the carriages on the street into watery apparitions. It was a pathetic fallacy, almost too perfect for the occasion, a world weeping in sympathy for their fallen fortunes. Annalise sat perfectly still, her hands folded in the lap of her modest gray morning dress. The fabric was well cared for, but undeniably worn, a stark contrast to the silks and velvets that had once filled her wardrobe. Beside her, her mother, Lady Eleanor, clutched a lace handkerchief, her shoulders trembling with silent sobs. At 17, Annalise's younger sister, Charlotte, was too young to be present for such grim business, a small mercy for which Annalise was profoundly grateful. The burden of their reality was heavy enough for 2 sets of shoulders. A third might have broken them completely. Across the great mahogany desk, Mr. Abernathy, their family solicitor for 3 decades, looked down at the ledgers with a funereal expression. He was a small, neat man whose spectacles seemed perpetually perched on the edge of his nose as if threatening to leap from the sheer gravity of the bad news he so often delivered. "The final accounting is, as we feared," he said, his voice a dry rustle of parchment. "The debts are considerable. Your father, bless his generous heart, was not a prudent investor. The shipping venture was a complete loss. The properties are mortgaged to the hilt." He cleared his throat, a small, nervous sound in the oppressive quiet. "Lord Finchley holds the largest of the notes. He has made his position quite clear." Annalise did not flinch. She had known this was coming. Lord Finchley was a man whose cruelty was as legendary as his wealth. He was old, twice a widower, with hands that seemed to rove of their own accord and a breath that smelled of stale port. His position was a thinly veiled proposal of marriage to her, a bartering of her future for her family's solvency. The thought sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the damp seeping in from the windows. She would be another acquisition, a pretty young thing to be displayed and discarded like his other wives. The prospect was a kind of living death. "There is no other way?" Annalise's voice was low but steady. She refused to let it tremble. She had become the anchor in her family's storm, the one who had to remain composed while her mother dissolved into grief. Mr. Abernathy sighed, polishing his spectacles with a piece of chamois. "Lord Finchley is not a man inclined to patience or charity. He will have his due, one way or another. To refuse his offer would be to invite utter destitution. You would lose everything. The house, your mother's pin money, everything. Destitution." The word hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Annalise pictured her mother and Charlotte cast out, forced to rely on the cold charity of distant relatives. She imagined Charlotte's bright spirit dimming, her future prospects extinguished before they had ever had a chance to ignite. Annalise could endure much for herself, but she could not endure that. She was steeling herself, preparing the words of assent that felt like swallowing broken glass, when Mr. Abernathy hesitated. "However," he began, leaning forward, a strange new light in his tired eyes. "A most unusual correspondence arrived this morning. It presents an alternative, a highly unconventional one, I must admit, but an alternative nonetheless." He slid a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper across the desk. The script was bold and black, the letters stark and decisive. There was no salutation, no preamble. It was a proposal, but of a kind Annalise had never imagined. It was from the solicitors of Alistair Thorne, the Duke of Blackwood. The Duke of Blackwood. His name was a whisper in the drawing-rooms of London, a figure of myth and shadow. He was impossibly wealthy, the owner of vast estates in the north, coal mines and shipping lines that her father could only have dreamed of. But he was also a recluse. He had not been seen in London society for years, not since the tragic death of his young wife. Rumors swirled around him like the northern mists that were said to shroud his ancestral home. They said he was disfigured, that he was mad with grief, that his heart was a shard of ice buried in his chest. The proposal was as cold and direct as the man's reputation. The Duke required a wife, a duchess, a woman of impeccable breeding and unimpeachable character to serve as the mistress of his household and a mother to his young daughter. In return, he would settle the entirety of the Beaumont family's debts, provide a generous living for Lady Eleanor and Charlotte, and ensure Charlotte's future with a handsome dowry. The terms were laid out like a business contract. There was no mention of affection, of companionship, of any of the softer sentiments one associated with marriage. It was a transaction. Her title and reputation in exchange for his gold and protection. "The Duke of Blackwood?" Lady Eleanor whispered, her tears momentarily forgotten. "But why Annalise? He could have any woman in England." "Precisely," Mr. Abernathy said, tapping the letter. "He does not want any woman in England. He does not want a debutante seeking a love match, or a social climber seeking influence. His solicitors were quite specific. He requires a woman of good family, in a position of some delicacy. A woman who will understand the nature of the arrangement and be grateful for the security it provides. A woman who will not come to him with romantic expectations." Each word was a small, sharp sting. He wanted a wife who was desperate, a wife who would be too indebted to him to make demands. He was not offering a marriage, he was offering a gilded cage. Annalise stared at the letter. On one hand, Lord Finchley, a life of certain, lecherous misery. On the other, the Duke of Blackwood, a life of cold, unknown emptiness. One was a prison of the body, the other a prison of the soul. But the Duke's prison came with freedom for her mother and sister. It was a choice that was no choice at all. "He wishes to meet with you," Mr. Abernathy continued, his voice softer now. "Tomorrow, at his London residence, to finalize the terms." Annalise's mind raced. The Duke's London house was a stone fortress on the edge of the park, its windows always dark, its gates always locked. To step inside would be to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. She thought of her father, of his foolish, hopeful smile as he'd spoken of his ventures. He had wanted to give them the world, and had instead brought them to ruin. It was up to her now to salvage what was left. She looked at her mother's pale, tear-streaked face, and the image of Charlotte's innocent laughter echoed in her mind. Her own hopes, her own girlish dreams of a marriage built on love and mutual affection, seemed like frivolous things, luxuries she could no longer afford. They were ashes, the last remnants of a life that had burned down around her. She lifted her chin, the gesture small but resolute. The rain continued to beat against the window pane, a somber drumbeat marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. "I will meet him," Annalise said, her voice clear and devoid of emotion. "Please inform the Duke's solicitors that I accept his invitation." The Blackwood residence was less a house than a mausoleum. Carved from immense blocks of Portland stone, it loomed over the street, its facade cold and unnervingly symmetrical. Every window was draped in heavy velvet, swallowing the watery morning light and giving nothing back. Annalise felt its stony gaze upon her as she stepped down from the hired carriage, a solitary figure in black against the unforgiving gray. She was ushered into a cavernous hall by a butler who moved with the silent, spectral grace of a man long accustomed to a house devoid of life. Her footsteps echoed on the black and white marble floor. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint, clean scent of beeswax and something else, something like old stone and forgotten memories. There were no flowers, no portraits on the walls, no personal effects to soften the severe architectural grandeur. It was a place scrubbed clean of warmth, of personality, of joy. The butler led her to a vast library. Bookshelves soared from floor to ceiling, their leather-bound spines a tapestry of gold and crimson, yet they offered no comfort. They felt less like a collection to be read, and more like a fortress wall, built to keep the world out. A fire crackled in the hearth, but its flames seemed to produce no heat, their light dancing over the dark, polished wood without effect. And then she saw him. He was standing by the window, his back to her, a tall, imposing silhouette against the gray light. He did not turn as she entered. The butler announced her name, and then retreated, closing the heavy oak doors behind him with a soft, final click. The sound sealed them in together, two strangers in a silent, echoing room. For a long moment he did not move or speak. Annalise stood her ground, her heart a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She would not show fear. She would not show weakness. This was a negotiation, and she was the commodity being traded. Her dignity was the only thing she had left to her name. Finally, he turned. The rumors had done him a disservice. He was not disfigured. He was, Annalise thought, with a strange, detached part of her mind, the most handsome man she had ever seen. His hair was as black as a raven's wing, his features sharp and aristocratic, as if carved from marble. But the rumors had been right about his eyes. They were a pale, glacial blue, and they held an emptiness so profound it seemed to absorb the light from the room. They looked upon her without interest, without curiosity, as if she were a piece of furniture that had just been delivered. "Lady Annalise," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, as devoid of warmth as the rest of him. "Thank you for coming." It was a statement of fact, not a welcome. "Your Grace," she replied, inclining her head in a shallow curtsy. He gestured to a chair opposite the one by the fire. "Please." She sat, smoothing the folds of her dress. He remained standing, a deliberate act that established his dominance in the room. He moved to stand before the fireplace, one arm resting on the mantelpiece, looking down at her from his great height. "I will not waste your time with pleasantries, Lady Annalise," he began, his tone clipped and precise. "You have seen my proposal. You understand its nature. I do. Good. Let me be perfectly clear about what I require and what I offer, so there are no misunderstandings between us." He spoke as if dictating a letter to his solicitor, each word carefully chosen and stripped of any emotional coloring. "I require a duchess. You will manage my households here and at Blackwood Manor. You will act as hostess when protocol demands it, which I assure you will be infrequent. You will carry yourself with the dignity and discretion befitting your station." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "And you will provide me with an heir, a son." The bluntness of it stole her breath. He spoke of creating a child as if it were another clause in a contract, a duty to be performed. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach. "In return," he continued, oblivious or indifferent to her reaction, "I will settle every penny of your late father's debts. Your family will be secure. Your mother will receive a generous annuity, and your sister will be provided with a dowry that will allow her to make a match of the highest order. You, as my wife, will want for nothing in the material sense. You will have access to my fortune, my jewels, my homes. They will be yours to command." He fell silent again, letting the weight of his offer settle in the room. It was a staggering proposition, a fortune beyond her wildest imaginings. It was salvation. "There are conditions, of course," he added, his voice dropping slightly, becoming even colder, if such a thing were possible. "My life is my own. I expect you not to intrude upon it. We will maintain separate chambers. Our interactions will be functional. I do not offer companionship, and I do not require it. I offer you my name, my protection, and my wealth. I do not offer affection. You must understand this above all else. There will be no love between us. There will be no friendship. There will only be the fulfillment of our respective duties." Annalise felt a tremor run through her, but her expression remained a mask of calm. This was worse than she had imagined. He was not just a grieving man. He was a man who had declared war on the very concept of emotion. He was building a fortress not only of stone and mortar, but of cold, hard rules. "I also have a daughter," he said, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Clara, she is 6 years old. She is unwell. She does not speak. You will be her stepmother. You will see to her needs, ensure she is cared for by her governess and nurse, but you are not to interfere. Her care is a delicate matter." The words were a warning. "Stay away from my child. Stay away from my heart." Annalise looked at this cold, beautiful, broken man and saw the vast, desolate landscape of her future stretching out before her. It was a future of silent dinners, empty rooms, and polite, meaningless exchanges, a life of immense wealth and profound loneliness. But it was also a future where her mother was safe, where Charlotte could laugh and dance and marry for love. She had made her choice in Mr. Abernathy's office. This was merely the signing of the deed. She met his icy gaze without flinching. "Your terms are explicit, Your Grace." "Are they acceptable?" For a fleeting second, she allowed herself to imagine another life. A life where she could say no, could walk out of this cold, dark house and back into the rain, a free woman, even if she was impoverished. But the image of her mother's face, etched with fear and grief, rose before her. Freedom was a luxury she had forfeited. "They are," she said, her voice a whisper of sound in the great, silent room. "They are acceptable." A flicker of something, surprise, relief, passed through his eyes, so quickly she thought she might have imagined it. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Very well. My solicitors will handle the arrangements. We will be married by special license at the end of the week." He straightened up, his business concluded. The audience was over. "Good day, Lady Annalise." He turned his back on her then, returning to his vigil at the window, dismissing her as easily as he would a servant. Annalise rose, her legs unsteady beneath her. She walked out of the library, through the echoing hall, and back out into the London grey, leaving the man who was to be her husband standing like a statue in his self-imposed tomb. She was to be the Duchess of Blackwood. She had saved her family, and she had never, in all her life, felt so completely and utterly alone. Blackwood Manor rose from the rolling northern moorland like a jagged piece of the landscape itself, a great brooding edifice of dark gray stone that seemed to challenge the very sky. As their carriage crested the final hill, Annalise felt the sheer, oppressive weight of it settle upon her. It was not a home, it was a fortress, its battlements and turrets stark against a sky the color of slate. The wind howled around it, a lonely, keening sound that seemed to be the manor's true voice. This was to be her home, her prison. The journey north had been a silent, formal affair. The Duke had accompanied her as propriety dictated, but had spoken barely a dozen words to her in 2 days. He sat opposite her in the well-sprung carriage, a book open in his lap, though she never once saw him turn a page. He was a master of stillness, his presence a palpable void that sucked the warmth and conversation from the air. Annalise had spent the time gazing out the window, watching the green fields of the south give way to the wild, wind-swept beauty of the north, feeling as though she were traveling not just across the country, but to the very edge of the world. As they drew up to the massive front doors, they were opened from within by the same spectral butler from the London house, whose name she now knew was Finch. The entire household staff was assembled in the grand entrance hall, a somber line of black and gray uniforms. At their head stood a woman with iron-gray hair, pulled into a severe bun, and a ramrod-straight posture. The Duke made the introductions with his customary brevity. "This is Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. She will see to your needs." Mrs. Gable curtsied, her eyes a surprisingly warm shade of brown, assessing Annalise with a look that was neither welcoming nor hostile, but simply watchful. "Your Grace," she said, her voice crisp. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor." Annalise managed a small smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable. I am pleased to make your acquaintance." The tour of the house was a blur of cavernous rooms, heavy Tudor paneling, and ancestral portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her with grim disapproval. The furniture was shrouded in dust covers in many of the wings, as if the house were holding its breath, waiting for a life that would never return. The silence here was different from the silence in the London residence. It was older, deeper, layered with centuries of secrets. The Duke led her to her chambers, a suite of rooms that were spacious and well-appointed, but as impersonal as a hotel. A fire had been lit in the sitting room, but it did little to dispel the chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. "These are your rooms," he stated. "My own are in the east wing. We will dine at 8. Finch will show you the way." And with that, he was gone, his footsteps receding down the long, empty corridor. Left alone, Annalise sank onto a chaise lounge, the velvet cool beneath her touch. She was a duchess, the mistress of this vast, silent estate, and yet she felt like a ghost, an unwelcome spectre in a house already crowded with them. Later, she met her stepdaughter. Mrs. Gable led her to the nursery, a large room at the top of the house. The room was filled with expensive toys, a dollhouse the size of a small cupboard, a handsome rocking horse, shelves of brightly colored books, but they all sat untouched, pristine, as if in a shop window. In the center of the room, sitting on the floor, was a small girl with hair as black as her father's and eyes that were a startlingly dark, deep blue. She was unnaturally still, her small hands clasped in her lap. She did not look up as they entered. "This is Lady Clara," Mrs. Gable said softly. Annalise knelt, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Hello, Clara," she said gently. "My name is Annalise." The child did not respond. She didn't even blink. She continued to stare at a spot on the floor, her expression utterly blank. It was as if she were not there at all, a perfectly crafted doll whose spirit had long since departed. Annalise's heart ached for her. This was the unwell child her husband had warned her away from. She was not unwell. She was lost, drowning in a silence as profound as her father's. Annalise reached a hand out, instinctively wanting to offer comfort, but Clara flinched back so violently she almost toppled over. A small animal sound of fear escaped her lips. Annalise immediately withdrew her hand, a sharp pang of regret piercing through her. The governess, a stern-faced woman named Miss Pratt, stepped forward. "She does not like to be touched, Your Grace." Annalise rose, her cheeks flushing. "I see. I am sorry. I did not mean to frighten her." She backed away, leaving the silent child in her circle of untouchable grief. The Duke's warning echoed in her ears. "You are not to interfere." The days that followed settled into a monotonous, chilling routine. Annalise would wake, breakfast alone in her rooms, and then attempt to learn the geography of the sprawling manor. She would take her lunch on a tray, as the Duke was invariably closeted in his study, managing the vast affairs of his estate. She would see Clara only at a distance, a small, fleeting figure in the gardens, always accompanied by the dragon-like Miss Pratt. Dinners were the worst. They were held in a baronial dining hall that could have seated 50, but was occupied only by the two of them at opposite ends of a long, polished table. The space between them felt like a chasm. They ate in near total silence, the only sounds the clinking of silver against porcelain and the crackle of the fire. The Duke never looked at her, his gaze fixed on his plate or some point in the middle distance. He would ask perfunctory questions about her day, to which she would give brief, equally perfunctory answers. These exchanges were not conversation. They were the hollow echoes of it. She began to observe him, studying the man who was her husband. She saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hands would sometimes clench into fists when he thought no one was watching. She saw the profound, bone-deep weariness in his eyes when he would stare into the fire, his mask of cold indifference momentarily slipping. He was a man in constant, silent pain. One afternoon, exploring a little-used corridor, she came upon a heavy, locked door at the end of a passageway. It was different from the others. It was made of black oak with a large, ornate iron lock. Dust lay thick on the floor before it, undisturbed for what must have been years. When she asked a young housemaid about it, the girl blanched and scurried away. Later, she posed the question to Mrs. Gable. The housekeeper's face became guarded. "That is the west wing, Your Grace," she said, her voice low. "It has been closed since the death of the first Duchess. His Grace's orders. No one is to enter." The locked wing, a physical manifestation of his sealed-off heart. Annalise stood before it often in the weeks that followed, her hand hovering over the cold iron of the lock. Whatever had happened to his first wife, whatever tragedy had shattered this family, the heart of it lay behind that door. And it was a place she was forbidden to go. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, and she was a stranger here, living on the cold periphery of a grief she could not understand and was not permitted to share. The suffocating stillness of the manor began to wear on Annalise's spirit. The endless corridors, the silent meals, the pervasive sense of a house holding its breath. It was a weight that pressed down on her day and night. She felt her own vitality beginning to ebb, her thoughts turning as gray as the stone walls that confined her. She needed air, she needed life, she needed something to nurture, something to bring back from the brink of decay. She found it just beyond the formal terraces at the back of the house. Hidden behind a high brick wall, accessible through a heavy, vine-choked wooden door, lay what had once been the Duchess's private garden. Annalise pushed the groaning door open and stepped inside, and her breath caught in her throat. It was a scene of magnificent dereliction. What must have once been a stunningly beautiful walled garden, a symphony of color and scent, was now a tangled, chaotic wilderness. Roses grew wild, their thorny canes reaching for the sky like grasping arms. Weeds choked what were once meticulously laid-out flower beds. A stone bench was almost completely consumed by ivy, and the small fish pond in the center was murky and clogged with fallen leaves. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. And yet it was not entirely dead. Here and there a defiant splash of color persisted. A hardy lavender bush still bloomed, its purple spires attracting a few determined bees. A cluster of bluebells had pushed their way through a mat of weeds. Life, however neglected, was still here. It was waiting. Annalise looked at the tangled mess and did not see ruin. She saw potential. She saw a reflection of the house, of the family within it, of the man she had married. A heart, once beautiful, now overgrown and neglected, choked by the weeds of grief. Perhaps, she thought, if she could bring this one small patch of earth back to life, she could prove to herself that it was possible. That beauty could be coaxed from despair. The next morning she asked Mrs. Gable for a pair of sturdy gardening gloves and some tools. The housekeeper looked surprised, but procured them without question. Annalise returned to the walled garden, tied her hair back, and set to work. It was back-breaking labor. She started in one small corner, pulling at the thick, stubborn roots of weeds, cutting back the overgrown thorns of the roses, clearing away years of debris. Her muscles ached, her hands became scratched and smudged with dirt, but with every weed she pulled, she felt a small measure of the oppressive weight on her own spirit begin to lift. Here, in this forgotten space, she was not the Duchess of Blackwood, the wife in a loveless contract. She was simply a woman tending a garden. She had a purpose. She worked for hours each day, losing herself in the rhythm of the physical work. The sun on her back, the smell of the turned earth, the satisfaction of clearing a small patch of ground, it was a balm to her soul. Her project did not go unnoticed. The household staff whispered amongst themselves, no doubt bewildered by their new duchess, who preferred digging in the dirt to embroidery or paying calls. Annalise ignored them. This garden was hers. Her other project was Clara. She did not try to force an interaction again. Instead, she began to bring the garden to her. She would leave a small, perfect wildflower on the table in the nursery vestibule each morning, a single bluebell, a sprig of lavender, a wild pansy. She never saw the child take them, but they were always gone by the next day. She also took to spending an hour in the nursery each afternoon. She wouldn't approach Clara directly. Instead, she would sit in a chair by the window and read aloud from a book of fairy tales, her voice soft and even. Miss Pratt watched her with hawk-like disapproval, but did not dare to forbid it. Clara, for her part, gave no indication that she was listening. She would continue to sit on her patch of carpet, staring into space. But Annalise persisted. She read of brave princesses and enchanted forests, of curses broken by kindness, her voice filling the silent room with stories of hope. One afternoon, after a week of this new routine, she was reading a story about a girl who could talk to birds. As she described the bright red of a robin's chest, she glanced over at Clara. The little girl's head was tilted, just slightly, in her direction. Her eyes were no longer fixed on the floor, but were gazing towards the window, as if she were trying to see the bird from the story. It was the smallest of acknowledgments, a barely perceptible shift. But to Annalise, it felt like the first ray of sunshine breaking through a storm-filled sky. It was enough. A few days later, she was kneeling in her garden, carefully transplanting a small rose bush she had rescued from a tangle of nettles, when a shadow fell over her. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun, and saw the Duke standing there. He was dressed for riding, his tall boots polished to a mirror shine, but he had clearly diverted from his path. He stood at the edge of the patch she had cleared, his expression unreadable. He looked from her dirt-smudged face to the small, orderly section of the garden, a tiny island of cultivation in a sea of wilderness. Annalise's heart began to beat a little faster. She expected a reprimand, a cold reminder that this was not her place, that she was overstepping the bounds of their arrangement. She braced herself for the inevitable dismissal. He was silent for a long time, his gaze sweeping over her work. Then he spoke, his voice as low and devoid of inflection as ever. "The soil is acidic on this side of the estate," he said, his gaze fixed on the struggling rosebush. "You will need to add lime if you expect that to survive." And then he turned and walked away, leaving her kneeling in the dirt. Annalise stared after him, stunned. It was not praise. It was not encouragement. It was a simple, practical statement of fact. But it was also an acknowledgment. He had seen what she was doing. He had engaged with it. In his own cold, distant way, he had participated. It was the longest, most personal sentence he had ever willingly spoken to her. A small, almost imperceptible crack had appeared in the wall of ice between them. A week later, a cart arrived from the village, delivering several large sacks of lime and a collection of high-quality gardening tools. There was no note. None was needed. Annalise went back to her work with a renewed sense of purpose, a tiny, fragile seed of hope beginning to take root in the barren soil of her own heart. The fragile truce of their existence, the quiet rhythm Annalise had established, was shattered by the arrival of a carriage one blustery Tuesday afternoon. Annalise was returning from her garden, her cheeks flushed from the wind, when she saw it, a lacquered black carriage with a crest on the door she did not recognize. Finch met her in the hall, his usual composure slightly ruffled. "Lady Beatrice Thorne has arrived, Your Grace," he announced, his voice tight. "The Duke's aunt." Annalise had heard of Lady Beatrice. She was the Duke's only living close relative, his late father's sister. She had been particularly close to Isabel, the first Duchess, and had, according to Mrs. Gable's discreet murmurs, made her disapproval of the Duke's swift remarriage known through a series of venomous letters. Annalise found her in the main drawing-room, already holding court, as if she were the mistress of the manor. She was a tall, hawk-faced woman, draped in expensive black silk and dripping with jet jewelry. She looked Annalise up and down, her thin lips curling into a semblance of a smile that did not come close to reaching her cold, calculating eyes. "So," Lady Beatrice said, her voice like splintering ice, "you are the replacement." Annalise felt a flush of anger, but kept her composure. "I am the Duchess of Blackwood, and you are welcome in our home, Lady Beatrice." The woman let out a short, sharp laugh. "Oh, it is her home, Alistair. Did you hear that? She has a proprietary air already." The Duke was standing by the fireplace, his expression grim. It was clear this visit was not one he had invited. "Beatrice, this is my wife, Annalise." "I know who she is," the woman snapped, turning her attention back to Annalise. "The bankrupt's daughter. A convenient purchase, I suppose. At least you are pretty enough. Isabel was a true beauty, and incomparable. But you have the look of a sensible broodmare. I suppose that is what Alistair requires now." The cruelty of the words was breathtaking. Annalise stood frozen, unsure how to respond to such a blatant attack. She glanced at her husband, but his face was a stony mask. He offered no defense. Lady Beatrice's visit stretched from a day into a week. She was a poisonous presence in the house, her every word a barb, her every look a judgment. She criticized Annalise's management of the household, her choice of menus, her very manner of dress. She made a great show of doting on Clara, sweeping into the nursery with expensive gifts and cloying words, all the while shooting triumphant, malicious glances at Annalise over the child's head. Clara, to her credit, remained impassive, retreating even further into her shell in the face of this loud, intrusive woman. The garden became Lady Beatrice's particular focus of scorn. She discovered Annalise there one afternoon, her hands deep in the soil. "Good heavens, child, what are you doing?" she exclaimed, her voice dripping with disdain. "You look like a common scullery maid. This was Isabel's garden, her sanctuary. You have no right to be digging it up like a truffle pig. You are desecrating her memory." "I am trying to bring it back to life," Annalise said, her voice tight. "Some things are better left to rest in peace," Lady Beatrice retorted, her eyes glittering. "You would do well to remember that." The campaign of undermining was relentless. Annalise bore it with as much dignity as she could muster, retreating into a cool, polite reserve. But it was exhausting. The most painful part was her husband's silence. He did not condone his aunt's behavior, but neither did he stop it. He simply withdrew further, becoming more remote and unapproachable than ever, leaving Annalise to fend for herself. She felt utterly alone, an unwelcome guest being tormented in a house that was supposed to be her own. The breaking point came during dinner on the 5th night of the visit. The meal had been another tense, silent affair, punctuated only by Lady Beatrice's cutting remarks. She had been talking at length about the previous Duchess, her beauty, her grace, her exquisite taste. "Isabel would never have served this wine," she announced, holding her glass up to the candlelight. "She had a far more sophisticated palate. But then, one cannot expect a merchant's granddaughter to understand such subtleties." The insult was aimed squarely at Annalise's maternal grandfather, whose modest success in trade was a source of great shame to the more aristocratic branches of her family. Annalise placed her fork down, her composure finally cracking. She felt the hot sting of tears behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She would not give this horrible woman the satisfaction. She was about to offer a quiet but firm rebuttal when the Duke spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the tension in the room like a shard of ice. "That is enough, Beatrice. Lady Beatrice turned to him, her eyebrows raised in surprise. "Alistair? I was merely making an observation." "You were not," he said, his pale eyes fixed on his aunt's face. "You have been insulting my wife since the moment you arrived." He paused, and for the first time he looked directly at Annalise, his gaze holding hers across the vast expanse of the table. "Lady Annalise's conduct as the Duchess of Blackwood has been unimpeachable. She has brought more grace to this house in a few short weeks than you have shown in your entire visit. You will apologize to her, or you will leave in the morning." The room fell into a stunned silence. Lady Beatrice's mouth opened and closed like a fish, speechless for the first time since she had arrived. Annalise's heart was hammering against her ribs. He had called her his wife. He had defended her. He had taken her side against his own family. Lady Beatrice, recovering her wits, threw her napkin onto the table. "Well, I see how it is. The little upstart has you twisted around her finger already. I will not stay where I am not wanted." She rose from her chair, her back rigid with fury. "I shall leave in the morning, Alistair, but do not come crying to me when you realize the mistake you have made." She swept from the room, leaving a quivering silence in her wake. Annalise sat perfectly still, her gaze still locked with her husband's. The chasm between them suddenly felt smaller. In the flickering candlelight, she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before, a flicker of respect, a grudging admiration. It was a small, fragile glimmer in the vast darkness of their marriage, but it was there. It was the first time she felt that, perhaps, just perhaps, she was not entirely alone in this cold, imposing house. The storm broke 2 weeks after Lady Beatrice's tumultuous departure. It rolled in off the moors without warning, a furious onslaught of wind and rain that lashed against the stone walls of the manor. The sky turned a bruised purple-black, and the world outside the windows dissolved into a churning gray chaos. The storm seemed to mirror a new turmoil within the house itself. Clara had been listless for a day, refusing her food and turning away from the stories Annalise tried to read her. That evening, a fever took hold. It came on swiftly, terrifyingly. One moment she was pale and quiet. The next she was burning hot, her small body trembling with violent shivers. Miss Pratt, for all her sternness, dissolved into a flustered panic. Mrs. Gable sent a groom to ride for the village doctor, but the road was already a river of mud, and the journey would take hours. Annalise took charge. "We need to bring the fever down," she said, her voice calm and steady, cutting through the rising hysteria. She sent a maid for cool water and cloths, another for extra blankets. She remembered the remedies her mother, a great believer in herbal lore, had always used. She dispatched a third maid to the kitchens for Willowbark to make a tea. She went to Clara's bedside. The child was tossing and turning, her breathing shallow, her eyes glazed and unfocused. Annalise gently began to sponge her forehead and wrists with a cool, damp cloth. Clara, who normally flinched from any touch, seemed to quiet slightly under Annalise's gentle ministrations. It was then that the Duke appeared in the doorway. He was a stark, frozen figure, his face as pale as his daughter's. He stared at the scene, at his sick child, at Annalise by her bed, and a look of raw, naked fear contorted his features. It was a look Annalise had never seen on him before. He seemed paralyzed, unable to move, unable to breathe. He was trapped in the grip of some past horror, reliving a nightmare she couldn't see. "Your Grace," Annalise said softly, not wanting to startle him. "She has a fever. We are doing all we can until the doctor arrives." He gave a jerky nod, but he did not enter the room. He could not seem to cross the threshold. He simply stood there, a helpless sentinel, his hands clenched at his sides. Annalise understood then. This was not just a father's fear for a sick child. This was something more, something deeper and more terrible. The memory of his first wife, of another sickbed, another vigil, was playing out in his mind's eye. He was terrified of losing Clara the same way. Annalise turned her focus back to the child. Throughout the long, dark night she did not leave Clara's side. She administered the willow bark tea, changed the cool compresses, and spoke to her in a low, soothing murmur, telling her she was strong, that she was safe. Mrs. Gable came and went, offering assistance, her usual reserve replaced by a quiet, worried compassion. The Duke remained a shadow in the corridor, sometimes appearing in the doorway, his face a mask of anguish, before retreating again into the darkness. He was a ghost at his own daughter's sickbed. Annalise felt a strange sense of purpose. All the loneliness, all the cold formality of her new life fell away. There was only this small, fragile life that needed her. She was not a duchess, not a party to a contract. She was simply a woman trying to comfort a sick child. Sometime in the pre-dawn hours, with the storm still raging outside, Annalise, utterly exhausted, fell into a light doze in the chair beside the bed. She was woken by a faint stirring. She opened her eyes to see the Duke standing over her. He had finally entered the room. In his hands, he held a heavy wool blanket. He did not speak. He simply unfolded it and gently draped it over her shoulders. His fingers brushed her neck for the briefest of moments. The touch was feather-light, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her entire body. It was the first time he had ever touched her. She looked up at him. In the dim lamplight, the shadows carved deep lines into his face. The anguish was still there, but it was mingled with something else: gratitude, awe. He was looking at her, truly looking at her, and seeing not the convenient bride he had purchased, but the woman who had stayed, who had fought for his daughter when he was too lost in his own demons to do so himself. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and then retreated to a chair in the far corner of the room, to continue his own silent, tormented vigil. The temporary, vulnerable alliance between them was sealed. In the heart of the storm, in the crucible of shared fear for a child's life, the first true thread of connection had been woven between the cold, distant Duke and his resilient, compassionate wife. The fever broke with the dawn. As the first pale, watery light of morning filtered through the nursery window, Clara's breathing deepened and became more regular. The violent shivering ceased, and a light sheen of perspiration covered her skin. She was sleeping peacefully, the crisis past. The storm outside had exhausted itself too, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily quiet. Annalise, limp with relief and fatigue, laid a hand on the child's forehead. It was cool to the touch. A wave of profound gratitude washed over her, so potent it made her feel dizzy. She looked over at the Duke. He was slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, but he looked up as she stirred. His eyes were red-rimmed, but the raw terror had been replaced by a fragile, dawning hope. Annalise gave him a small, tired smile. "The fever is gone." He rose and came to the bedside, his movements stiff. He reached out a hand as if to touch his daughter's cheek, but hesitated, his fingers hovering just above her skin. It was the same fear of touch, the same inability to connect, that he had passed on to his child. As if sensing their presence, Clara's eyelids fluttered open. Her dark blue eyes, clear and lucid for the first time in what felt like an eternity, moved from her father's face to Annalise's. Her lips parted. "Annalise," she whispered. The word was a faint, raspy thread of sound in the quiet room. But it was a word, her first word in months, her first word to Annalise. It was as if a spell had been broken. The Duke let out a choked sound, a half-sob, half-gasp. He sank to his knees by the bed, finally touching his daughter's hand, his broad shoulders shaking with the force of his emotion. Annalise quietly slipped from the room, leaving the father and daughter to their reunion. She felt she was intruding on a moment of profound, private healing. She made her way to the library, the same room where he had laid out the cold terms of their marriage. She felt a deep, bone-aching weariness, but also a strange sense of peace. She had done what she could. She had helped. She did not know how long she sat there, staring into the cold hearth, before she heard the door open behind her. It was the Duke. He looked ravaged, his face pale and drawn, but the glacial emptiness in his eyes had been replaced by a storm of raw, unguarded emotion. "The doctor has been," he said, his voice hoarse. "He says she will make a full recovery, thanks to you." "I only did what anyone would have done," Annalise replied softly. "No," he said, shaking his head as he came to stand before her. "Not anyone. I did nothing. I stood in the hallway like a coward while you—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He paced the room like a caged animal, his composure utterly shattered. "You were afraid," she said, her voice filled with a compassion that surprised even herself. "You were remembering." He stopped pacing and stared at her, his eyes wide with a terrible vulnerability. "How did you know?" "I saw it in your eyes," she said. "I saw it the day I arrived. This house, it is drowning in memory." He finally seemed to collapse, sinking into the chair opposite her. He buried his face in his hands, and when he spoke, his voice was muffled and thick with a grief that had been suppressed for years. "Her name was Isabel," he began, the words tearing from him as if from a deep, unhealed wound. "My first wife, Clara's mother. She was like sunshine. When we first married, this house was filled with light. But after Clara was born, a darkness fell over her, a melancholy. I didn't understand it." He lifted his head, and his eyes were filled with a self-loathing so profound it was painful to witness. "I was a fool. I was impatient. I told her she needed to be stronger, that she had a beautiful child, a husband who— I told her she had no reason to be sad. I thought I could command her to be happy, as if it were a choice." He swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the past. The illness grew worse. She would not eat. She would not leave her rooms in the West Wing. She stopped speaking, much like Clara. And I grew colder, more distant. I thought my coldness would force her to reach for me. Instead, I pushed her away. I left her utterly alone in her despair. He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping to trace a path down his cheek. "One morning, I went to her rooms. She had been quiet for a day, too quiet. The door was locked from the inside. When we finally broke it down—" He choked on the words, unable to continue. Annalise's heart broke for him, for the young, arrogant man who had not understood the depths of his wife's suffering, and for the broken man before her now who had been punishing himself for it ever since. "She was gone," he finally whispered. "She had taken her own life. In her letter, she said she was a burden, that we would all be better off. And I knew it was my fault, my coldness, my pride. I had killed her. I had driven her to it." The confession hung in the air, raw and devastating. This was the source of the manor's chill, the secret behind the locked door, the reason for his impenetrable armor. "Clara found the letter before I did," he continued, his voice barely audible. "She was only 3. She never spoke another word after that day. I had not only failed my wife, I had broken my child. I locked the West Wing. I locked away her memory. I locked away everything. I thought, if I could feel nothing, if I could become as cold and hard as the stone of this house, it would be a fitting penance. I vowed I would never let anyone close again. I would never risk destroying someone like that again." He looked at her then, his defenses gone, his soul laid bare. "And then I brought you here, into this tomb. I was so certain. I could maintain the distance, but I did not account for you, Annalise. I did not account for your quiet strength, for your kindness. You came into this place of death, and you began to plant a garden." He fell silent, his confession complete. Annalise looked at this man, stripped of all his ducal arrogance, and saw only a human being drowning in guilt and grief. She did not see a monster. She saw a man who had loved and lost, and blamed himself so completely that he had tried to erase himself from existence. Slowly she rose from her chair and went to him. She knelt before him, and without a word, she took his hand. His skin was cold, but his grip was surprisingly strong as his fingers closed around hers. It was not a gesture of pity, but one of solidarity, one of grace. "You have punished yourself enough, Alistair," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. It was a tragedy, a terrible, terrible tragedy. But it was not a crime. You are not a murderer. You were a young man who did not understand an illness that no one understood. You have paid your penance for 6 long years, and your daughter needs you. She needs her father, not the Duke of Blackwood, not a ghost, her father. He looked at their joined hands, then up at her face, his expression one of wonder. He had expected judgment, recrimination, perhaps even revulsion. He had not expected this. He had not expected compassion. The wall he had so carefully constructed around his heart, a wall that had withstood years of grief and isolation, finally crumbled into dust. The shared vulnerability of the sick room, combined with the catharsis of his confession and the shock of her acceptance, created a seismic shift within him. He saw her, truly saw her for the first time, not as a solution to his dynastic problem, but as the woman who had quietly, patiently, and without any expectation of reward, shown him a path out of the darkness. He lifted his free hand and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. His touch was hesitant, reverent. "Annalise," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name, and then he leaned forward and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, not a kiss of demand. It was a kiss of profound, shattering gratitude. It was a kiss of shared sorrow, of absolution, of a fragile and desperate hope. It was the taste of tears and the promise of a dawn after a long, dark night. In that single, gentle press of his lips against hers, the cold, formal contract that had defined their marriage was irrevocably broken, and something new, something tentative and tender and utterly terrifying, began to take its place. The silence in the house remained, but for the first time it was not empty. It was filled with unspoken possibility. In the days that followed, the very atmosphere of Blackwood Manor began to change. It was a subtle transformation, like the slow turning of a season. The oppressive weight that had seemed to seep from the walls began to lift, replaced by a tentative lightness. The change emanated from its master. Alistair, she thought of him as Alistair now, was a man slowly emerging from a long, self-imposed hibernation. The most noticeable difference was at the dinner table. He no longer sat at the far end of the great table, a distant, forbidding figure. He took the seat beside her. The chasm between them was closed. Their conversations were still quiet, often hesitant, but they were real. He asked about her garden, not with the detached air of a landowner, but with genuine interest, his questions thoughtful and specific. He spoke of the estate, of the tenants, of his plans for improving the land, sharing a part of his life with her that had previously been sealed away in his study. He began to spend time in the nursery. At first he would simply stand in the doorway, watching as Annalise read to Clara, but soon he began to enter, sitting in the chair he had occupied during his long vigil. One afternoon, Annalise looked up from her book to see him take a small wooden bird from a shelf and offer it to his daughter. Clara, after a moment's hesitation, took it from him, her tiny fingers brushing against his. It was a small miracle. Father and daughter, two silent souls trapped in the same grief, were finally beginning to find their way back to each other. Annalise's life, once so circumscribed by loneliness, began to expand. She felt a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with her title. She was no longer just the Duchess, a placeholder in a dead woman's home. She was Annalise, a woman who had a place here, a woman who was needed. Her quiet, patient efforts were bearing fruit not only in her walled garden, but in the wounded hearts of her new family. Her own heart was a landscape in turmoil. She had married this man out of duty, expecting nothing but a cold and empty life. She had steeled herself for it, but she had not been prepared for the man behind the mask. She had not been prepared for his profound grief, his deep capacity for love, twisted and buried as it was by guilt. She had not been prepared for the respect he had shown her or the vulnerability he had shared, and she was certainly not prepared for the way her heart now seemed to beat a little faster when he entered a room, or the warmth that spread through her chest when he offered her one of his rare, hesitant smiles. She was falling in love with her husband, and the realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. One bright, wind-swept morning, he sought her out in the garden. She was on her knees, tending to the rose bush that was now, against all odds, covered in healthy green leaves. "Walk with me," he said. It was not a command, but a request. He led her away from the manor, up onto the moors that rolled away to the horizon. The wind whipped at her skirts and tugged strands of hair from her chignon, but it felt cleansing, invigorating. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the cry of the curlews and the rustle of the heather. He led her to a high point, a rocky outcrop that overlooked the sea, a churning expanse of gray-blue water meeting the sky. "This was my mother's favorite place," he said, his voice carrying on the wind. "She said it was the only place where you could see the world without its edges." They stood for a long time, watching the waves crash against the distant cliffs. The sheer wild beauty of it was breathtaking. Finally, he turned to her, his expression serious, his pale eyes clear and direct. "Annalise," he began, his voice low and earnest, "the night I proposed our arrangement, I was a ghost, a man convinced he was already dead. I offered you a contract because it was all I believed I had left to give. I wanted to build a wall around myself so thick and so cold that no one could ever get through. I thought it was the only way to keep from hurting anyone ever again." He took a step closer, his gaze searching hers. "I was wrong. You did not try to tear down my walls. You simply planted a garden beside them. You showed my daughter a patience and a kindness that I had forgotten how to give. You stayed by her side when I ran away. You listened to my ugliest truths, and you did not judge me. You have shown me what it is to be truly strong, and what it is to be truly kind. You have brought life back to this place. You have brought life back to me." He reached out and took her hands, his grip warm and firm. "I am falling in love with you, Annalise. I know I have no right. I know I am a broken, haunted man who has already failed one wife so catastrophically, but I will not live the rest of my life by the terms of that cold, foolish contract, not if there is a chance for something more." His vulnerability was a raw, beautiful thing. He was offering her his shattered heart, hoping she would see it as something worth mending. "I only have one question," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Is there any hope that you could come to care for me? Could you ever find it in your heart to love a man like me?" Tears welled in Annalise's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a joy so profound it was painful. All her own unspoken feelings, all the love that had been growing in the quiet corners of her heart, rose to the surface. "You ask if I could come to care for you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Alistair, I already do. I have seen the man behind the ghost. I have seen his goodness and his pain and his capacity for love. I see not a broken man, but a man who deserves to be happy, to be whole again." A tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. "I am already in love with you." A look of pure, unadulterated wonder dawned on his face. A slow, genuine smile spread across his lips, transforming his handsome, solemn features into something boyishly joyful. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly smile, and it was like watching the sun rise after a long winter. He raised her hands to his lips and kissed them gently. Then, reaching into his waistcoat pocket, he produced a single, ornate iron key. It was old and heavy. She recognized it instantly. "This is the key to the West Wing," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He placed it in her palm and closed her fingers around it. "I cannot face the ghosts of the past alone, but perhaps together we can." Will you help me? Will you help me let the light back in?" Annalise looked from the key in her hand to the face of the man she loved, his eyes filled with hope and a future she had never dared to dream of. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Alistair. Together." The following morning they stood before the black oak door of the west wing. The air in the corridor was cold and musty, thick with the dust of years. Annalise could feel a tremor in Alistair's hand as he stood beside her. This was more than opening a door. It was an act of confronting the past, of finally challenging the ghosts that had held him and his house captive for so long. Annalise held the heavy iron key. She looked at Alistair, offering him a small, reassuring smile, and then fitted the key into the lock. It turned with a loud, grating groan, the sound of long disuse echoing in the silent hallway. She pushed the heavy door inward. A wave of stale, cold air washed over them. The wing was shrouded in darkness, every window covered by thick, heavy drapes. Dust motes danced like frantic sprites in the single shaft of light from the open doorway. Annalise took Alistair's hand, her grip firm and steady, and together they stepped across the threshold. The first thing they did was open the curtains. Alistair moved from window to window, pulling back the heavy velvet, while Annalise unfastened the latches and pushed the casements open. Sunlight and fresh, clean air flooded the rooms for the first time in 6 years, illuminating a scene of preserved sorrow. The rooms were just as Isabel had left them. A book lay open on a side table, a shawl was draped over the back of a chair, a silver-backed brush sat on the dressing table. It was a perfectly preserved monument to a life cut short. They did not speak much at first. They simply moved through the rooms, letting the light and air begin their work of cleansing. It was a somber, reflective process. Annalise could feel the weight of the tragedy that had occurred here, but it was no longer a terrifying, unknown presence. It was simply a deep, profound sadness. In the sitting room, Alistair stopped before a small writing desk. On it sat a single framed silver portrait. It was of a beautiful, laughing young woman with kind eyes and a cascade of fair hair. Isabel. Alistair picked it up, his fingers tracing the edge of the frame. "She loved this room," he said, his voice quiet and filled with a gentle melancholy rather than the sharp-edged guilt of before. "She said the morning light was best here." He looked at Annalise, his eyes clear. "She was a good person, Annalise, a gentle soul. I want you to know that. My failure does not diminish her." "I know," Annalise said softly, "and she would not want this house to be a tomb in her memory. She would want it to be filled with life, with laughter." That day marked the beginning of the wing's transformation. Over the next few weeks, they worked together. They carefully packed away Isabel's personal belongings, not as a way of erasing her, but of honoring her memory and putting it to rest. They chose new, lighter fabrics for the curtains and upholstery. They had the walls repainted in pale, cheerful colors. Annalise filled the rooms with vases of fresh flowers from her now flourishing garden. The west wing was not being erased, it was being reborn. It was becoming a part of the house again, a place of light and future, not of darkness and the past. The true healing, however, was in the family itself. Alistair, having finally unshackled himself from his guilt, became the father Clara needed. He read her stories. He took her for walks in the garden. He even taught her how to play chess with a small carved set he had had as a boy. And Clara, in the steady, loving presence of both her father and her stepmother, began to blossom. The silence that had enveloped her for so long gave way to whispers, then sentences, then a bright, childish chatter that filled the once silent halls of the manor with music. 1 year later, the world had been utterly transformed. Blackwood Manor was no longer a fortress of grief, but a home filled with warmth and light. The gardens under Annalise's dedicated care were a riot of color and scent, a testament to her patient, nurturing spirit. On a warm summer afternoon, Annalise sat on the stone bench in her walled garden, the same bench that had once been consumed by ivy. It was now clear, surrounded by blooming roses and fragrant lavender. She was not alone. Clara, now a happy, talkative 7-year-old, was chasing a butterfly nearby, her laughter echoing in the peaceful air. Annalise's hand rested on the gentle swell of her own stomach, a silent, joyful promise of the new life she and Alistair were bringing into the world. Alistair came to sit beside her, slipping his arm around her shoulders. He followed her gaze to their daughter, a look of pure, unadulterated love on his face. "Do you remember the first time I saw you in this garden?" he asked, his voice a low, happy rumble against her ear. "You were covered in dirt, and you looked so fierce and determined. I think I started falling in love with you in that very moment." Annalise leaned her head against his shoulder. "And I thought you were about to banish me for daring to disturb the, weeds," he chuckled, a rich, easy sound that she now heard every day. "I was a fool, a blind, stubborn fool. You came here because of a cold, heartless bargain, and you gave me back my life. You gave me back my daughter. You gave me a love I never believed I deserved." He turned her face to his and kissed her. A deep, tender kiss filled with all the love and gratitude that now defined their lives. It was a kiss of promises kept, of sorrows healed, and of a future that stretched before them, as bright and beautiful as the garden they had nurtured back to life together. The contract had been for a duchess and an heir, a loveless, practical arrangement. But love, in its quiet, resilient way, had found a crack in the stone walls and stubbornly, beautifully pushed its way into the light. Dear listener, have you ever encountered a soul that felt like a locked room? A person so guarded, so walled off by past hurts that it seemed impossible to ever truly know them? We often meet these people in our own lives, colleagues, family members, perhaps even partners. Our first instinct might be to turn away, to seek out the easy warmth of more open hearts, dismissing the closed-off ones as cold, difficult, or simply not worth the effort. The story of Annalise and Alistair is a quiet reminder of a more compassionate path. Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, was the epitome of a locked room. He had sealed himself away in a fortress of grief and guilt, convinced that his coldness was a penance he had to pay and a shield he had to carry. He presented the world with a contract, a set of rigid, unfeeling terms, because it was safer than offering the fragile, broken truth of his own heart. But Annalise did not try to break down his door. She didn't rattle the lock or demand entry. Instead, she did something far more profound. She simply began to tend the neglected garden outside his walls. Through her quiet acts of patience, with a grieving child, with a wild patch of earth, with a silent, sorrowful man, she brought life back to the world around him. She demonstrated that healing was possible, not through force, but through gentle, persistent care. She showed him that light could still exist, and in doing so, she gave him the courage to find the key and open the door himself. In our own hurried, often superficial world, it is a powerful lesson. True connection is rarely forged in grand, dramatic gestures. More often, it is built in the small, consistent acts of grace we show to one another. It's in listening without judgment when someone finally shares their pain. It's in offering our steady presence, even when we are met with silence. It is in choosing to see the potential for a beautiful garden where others see only tangled weeds. So the next time you encounter a locked room, perhaps pause for a moment. You may not have the key, and it is not your job to force your way in. But you can always choose to plant a flower nearby. You can choose to offer a kindness without expectation. You can choose to let your own light shine, creating a warmth that might, just might, encourage them to one day step out into the sun. Because sometimes the most broken hearts are not looking for a savior to rescue them, but simply for a patient gardener to show them that life and love can still grow. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking, sharing it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribing for more tales of the heart. Your support allows us to continue bringing these stories to life.